We're joined today by Dr. Buzz Aldrin. Dr. Aldrin, thank you for joining us. First question, where did the name Buzz come from, the nickname Buzz?
Well, I was a junior, Edwin Eugene Aldrin Jr., and the nickname Eddie was used for my father by the Air Corps, and my mother didn't like that, so she called him Gene. So the two nicknames were gone, and I had two older sisters, so I was referred to as their brother, but they couldn't pronounce that. It came out Buzzer. So for the first 5 years, I guess, of my life, I was Buzzer, and then I became Buzz, and everybody just called me that. So I waited a while, and when I would get into something, pretty soon everyone would call me Buzz, and nobody would call me Edwin or anything like that. So after my father died, I decided to just legalize and change my name in court legally. So it's that way at my passport and driver's license. No middle initial, just Buzz Aldrin.
Well, it seems to fit you anyway, huh?
Well, I hope so. Disney and Pixar seem to think so, yeah.
What was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in upper middle class. My father was an early aviation pioneer, and he was in the Air Corps. And then in 1928, he went into the reserve to work for Standard Oil of New Jersey, and I'm sure they gave him some stock incentive benefits during that build-up period of economy. But then in 1929, he cashed in a number of those to buy a house in Montclair, New Jersey, just before the stock market crash. So we grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, in an upper middle class environment, and it was comfortable. It was a wonderful suburban town to grow up and have friends up and down the street. And then I went away to summer camp in Maine, starting when I was 9 years old, and I continued to go there for 2 months of every summer until I was 16. And that really taught me a lot about competitiveness and teamwork and camaraderie. And I give a lot of credit to that particular summer camp in Maine for developing the athletic competitiveness.
Competitiveness a big part of your life?
Well, I guess so. Probably more in individual. I learned to pole vault by, maybe imitating some people, and then I left it alone for a while until I was almost in high school, and then I took it up again and did quite well. So I continued that through West Point. And this is before the time when the poles bent 90 degrees and became a gymnastic event. But it was an individual sport, more than a team one. I was reasonably well coordinated, so I was on the football team. But I deferred from the team my junior year in high school to prepare for academics to get into West Point. And when they played the first game that fall, I was very sorry that I had done that because I wanted to be a part of that. So in my senior year, all the backfield positions were taken. So I was a 168-pound center on an undefeated, untied state champion football team at the highest level. We were an outstanding group of competitors.
Where did the interest in rocketry come from?
Well, the interest in rocketry didn't come when I was at West Point. I had a classmate who was quite interested. His father was a general, and he was very smart. We were near the top of the class, but he was fascinated with rockets from the Army perspective. And we visited Fort Bliss during one of the summer times, and somehow I just didn't see that as being competitive with the Air Force flying airplanes and fighters. And so when I graduated from West Point in 1951, third in my class, I went into the Air Force and went through pilot training and graduated in Texas, went through Las Vegas gunnery training, and was involved in the Korean War for the last 6 months in 1953 of the Korean War.
You flew a couple, more than 60 missions in Korea, didn't you?
Yes, 66 missions. When I first got over to Korea, this is reflecting back. There was a captain from the Marines who was in a neighboring squadron, John Glenn. He was flying his second tour of combat. First tour was in the Navy Panther jets, and now he was going to be able to fly the Air Force F-86. So near the end of the war, why I think he eventually was credited with shooting down 3 MiGs, and I happened to get into a fortunate position twice and shot down 2 MiGs.
What is the feeling when you're in combat like that?
It's of great uncertainty. You hope that your wingman is doing his job because you're concentrating very much on the task in front of you of lining up your gun sight and making the intercept, and then watching to see how well your gunnery is. So the first kill was a very gentle one, and it made Life magazine Picture of the Week because it was the first time gun camera film had ever taken a picture of the canopy coming off and then the fire of the ejection seat and seeing the pilot being ejected from the MiG-15. The second one, I didn't have a wingman. I was in a quite a gaggle on an important mission where they were bombing right close to the dam on the Yalu River, and the MiGs were stirring around a good bit, and I happened to find myself in a position of still trying to catch up with the number 3 man, and a MiG got in front of me, and we went back and forth, and that gives you a feeling of great concern when you don't know who might be behind you. You can't take your eye off the task of the competitiveness with the person in front of you to look back behind. You just hope for the best. And it turned out that there wasn't anybody behind me.
Now, at that point in your life, in your career, was that what you were aiming to do, or where did you have your sights set at that point?
Well, I was very satisfied with the way that the 23-year-old turned out to embark on the beginning of his career as a second lieutenant. And from Korea, I went back and instructed in gunnery. A lot of people ask about spaceflight, if we're afraid or scared or fearful. It's no comparison to being in combat, where everything is unknown, how things are going to unfold, what he's going to do, what you're going to do. All of those things are not according to any particular plan. And he's out to get you, and things are happening in a hurry. In spaceflight, except during the launch, usually things are happening quite slowly. And there's so much attention that's been paid to exercising over and over again all of the normal procedures, and then concentrating on as many of the emergency procedures as you possibly can. So you feel quite confident that you know what to do in spaceflight, and there isn't a concern for having a clouded mind that fear brings on.
And that would serve you well later. I understand that Apollo 11, when that lifted off, your heartbeat was below normal?
Well, I wasn't watching. It was probably peaceful, let me put it that way. Relieved that we were on our way.
Talk about your MIT career to a certain extent. What was the degree you got? Do they still even offer that sort of degree, that postgraduate degree, and that sort of thing?
Well, when I left the Air Force Academy, where I was aide to the Dean of Faculty, and got an assignment over to Germany to fly F-100s in 1956. When I got over there, a good friend of mine from West Point on the track team, Ed White, was over there. And he had been there about 1.5 years or 2 years, so he talked me into getting into this one squadron that had a very good spirit to it, the 22nd Squadron. And we flew F-100s there. Ed and I represented our squadron on NATO gunnery competition. Then he rotated back about 1.5 years or 2 years before I did, and he went to Michigan for a 2-year master's program, and then he wrote me that he was going to go through the test pilot school. So when it came time for me to go back, it seemed appropriate in that part of my career, with about 8 years of service, to go back to MIT, where my father had gotten his doctorate degree. So I selected that as my next assignment, and when I got there, maybe 6 months after, I was involved in getting settled into the math and calculus and differential equations. I was doing well enough that I felt that I could extend my program for a doctor's degree. Now, this is in 1960 and 61. And of course, 61 in April was when Yuri Gagarin made his first flight, April 12th, and then Alan Shepard, May 5th, 1961. By this time, I had already selected my thesis being rendezvous in space. I felt I knew how to intercept airplanes in the atmosphere, and I was intrigued with the potential and the necessity for bringing things together with human involvement in space. So with the target in orbit, I wanted to come up with ways where you could step by step, so that the pilot, the astronaut, could understand what he was doing. So I wrote my thesis on line of sight guidance techniques
Excuse me.
for manned orbital rendezvous. And I look back on that and look back on the year 1961 and 62. You know, it wasn't until February of 1962 that John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. And by that time, I was well into writing my thesis. And that particular subject has been very satisfying. I can hardly believe that I had the insight or the wisdom, or whatever you might call it, to have selected that subject, because eventually I was able to use those techniques that I learned there to help suggest to NASA the modifications that they could make in the rendezvous procedures for the Gemini program. And those went so well in the Gemini program that Apollo changed its procedures somewhat. And the essence of what I had worked on in my thesis became how we had the astronaut understand better what was happening, so that he could make calculations and rough measurements to back up the computer or the radar if they failed during the mission. And of course, this is very critical, because we made the decision in 1961 to use the strategy at the moon of lunar orbit rendezvous. So 2 spacecraft went to the moon, 1 landed, and then it had to lift off and rendezvous with the other spacecraft around the moon, with not all that much assistance from Earth. The tracking from Earth is phenomenally accurate, and of course it was very, very useful for all of the maneuvers. And it got us in good position to make a landing. Of course, we'll never forget that first landing. We were a heavier than normal spacecraft, because it was an early spacecraft. So, and we had computer alarms during the descent, which caused a distraction from where we were heading. And when Neil took over manually at about 500 feet and maneuvered around a crater that had some rocks in it, and selected a place to land, by the time we were about 100 feet, we were down to 60 seconds of fuel left, and it was getting pretty close. Fortunately, at 30 seconds, we were a little bit more than 10 feet maybe, but we touched down with maybe about 15 seconds of fuel left.
So the work that you did at MIT really bore fruit.
Well, not only in helping formulate the basic approach to rendezvous in the Gemini and Apollo program, where one would wait until you got into a position and then you would make an intercept that was near standard, or as close to standard as possible, so that you could then expect things to happen in a certain sequence. That has been used pretty much since then. But what it also gave me was a sense of understanding of the relative motion of two objects as they're going around together in orbit. And I've moved from orbits around the Earth or around the Moon to now using that gut feeling, that seat-of-the-pants approach, to look at orbits between Earth and Mars, cycling orbits that go around the Sun and swing by the Earth with gravity assist that then results in a swing by of Mars and comes back to Earth again. So it's been very helpful in my formulating what I believe is the best strategy for going to Mars with human beings. And I hope that'll happen in about 20 years.
Let me take a step back for a second. Talk to me, if you will, a little bit about the early days of the space program. You had mentioned in one of your books that Kennedy coming out and saying that we'll have a man on the moon by the end of this decade was the height of chutzpah. What was it like? What was the excitement like? What was the feeling like? What was the energy like during those days?
Well, when that happened in May 25th of 1961, when Kennedy made that speech, I was at MIT. And I forget exactly where the circumstances were when I heard about that. But I was underway in my doctoral thesis at that point, and it wasn't until the beginnings of 1963 that I left MIT. I came back in June of 1963 to receive my degree, but I was at that time stationed in Los Angeles with the Space Division, eventually moving to Houston to work in the Air Force Experiments Office supporting the Gemini program. And it was there in the fall of 1963 that I was notified that I was selected to be in the third group of astronauts.
Do you think that it was doable, that we could reach the moon by the end of the 1960s?
I had no reason to think otherwise. There just was not a wealth of experience in how well a nation could pioneer in such a new venture as getting spacecraft into orbit, getting the people back down again in fairly accurate landings as we return back to Earth, long-duration flights, spacewalking. We had some problems initially in spacewalking, and I came along at just the right time to be able to train underwater in neutral buoyancy for my Gemini 12 flight. And by that time, we also had improved the foot restraints. So spacewalking became much easier to demonstrate that we knew what we were doing by the time we got to the end of the Gemini program. My regret was that the Air Force maneuvering backpack had been canceled by NASA on that last mission, and I feel that I certainly could have done a very credible job making use of that maneuvering unit in 1966, in November 1966. It wasn't until in the mid-'80s with the space shuttle that we actually exercised a backpack maneuvering unit. I think they had one inside the Skylab flight, but it wasn't outside in space until parts of the shuttle program.
Was NASA necessary, do you think, or could the Air Force or the military have done just as good, if not better, job?
Well, that's a high-level position for a captain or a major that I was at that time. I think it was a smart move to expand NACA into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and to give them the open program of proceeding with the challenge that President Kennedy set for us of going to the moon. Of course, it was already NASA by that time. But I think that was a wise choice. The Air Force, in its missions of potentially making use of man in space or humans in space, seemed to to vacillate back and forth. At first there was a dinosaur program that was to be launched on top of a Titan, and that competed a little bit with the Gemini program, so the dinosaur program was canceled. And then part of the studies that I was involved in was to see whether the Air Force might want to fly the last 2 missions or another additional 2 missions at the end of the Gemini program, but the Air Force decided not to do that. And then there was the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, where a modification of Gemini was being considered, and they actually selected Manned Orbiting Laboratory astronauts and trained them for a period of time, and then that program was canceled. Then we got into the Space Shuttle, and it looked like the Air Force was going to be involved in that. There was a manned space flight engineer program, and then that was set aside. So there was this on and off and on and off, and I think the Air Force is still trying to determine exactly where the human fits into the missions that the Air Force sees in the future. And I think there will be room for manned spaceflight activities with some of the missions of the future, orbiting space-based lasers, space planes. Some of that, of course, can be carried out without human crews, but then again, we just might want to have military pilots involved in space plane activities at some point. And of course, inspection and servicing and repair of some of the military assets just may come along in the future as a very desirable thing.
What was it like being an astronaut during the 1960s? You guys were really like rock and roll stars.
Well, we didn't look at ourselves quite as rock and roll. I didn't have all that great appreciation for that style of music. I come to accept what is in being, but I kind of like the ballroom type music of the 50s and maybe the early 60s. Well, I was in the 3rd group of astronauts, and there was a distinct seniority between the first group that was selected in 1959, the Mercury astronauts, and then it was 3, almost 4 years later when the second group of astronauts were selected, and they were all test pilots. I applied for that group, but I wasn't a test pilot, so they couldn't select me. But you didn't have to be a test pilot the next year for the 3rd group of astronauts. So I came in with 2 or 3 other people in our group of 14. The second group had 9 people in it. We had 14 people in our group, and several of us were not test pilots. And there was a distinct view I sensed from the ones who were test pilots, looking maybe down somewhat on those of us who were not test pilots. I chose a different career path. I put more emphasis on professional education. That's what my father had done, and that's what other people had done. Somehow, with the tour of combat in Korea and then the other assignments, it just didn't occur to me that I wanted my career to be dependent upon my coordinated skills as a pilot. I wanted it to be more relying on my professional knowledge and creativity. And fortunately, I chose the route that I think suited me fine, and the timing turned out to be just almost perfect when I came along with that education and that experience to get into the astronaut program when I did. The only problem was that for the most part, the people in the 3rd group of astronauts were not commanders of flights. We were the pilot or the second in command, except for some of the people who had flown several times. And in the latter part of the Apollo program, some of our 3rd group did command flights.
Was there a lot of jockeying around to be on the first mission to the moon? A lot of jockeying around with the astronauts themselves?
Well, there was a lot of wondering. I wouldn't really call it jockeying around. I'm sure that some people felt they had better access to the selection process that was pretty much determined by the two people in the Mercury program, Alan Shepard in charge of the astronaut office as the chief astronaut office, and Deke Slayton, who was grounded, and he was in charge of flight crew operations. So those two people essentially selected the sequence of crews. Now, once that sequence was selected, there wasn't too much opportunity for changing around. And as I mentioned, those of us in the third group, we were going to be flying with someone in the second group, so we were going to be the junior person. And my first space flight, I went from the backup crew with Jim Lovell. Because of a tragic airplane accident, we ended up backing up Gemini 9, and then we flew together on the prime crew of Gemini 12. And when we got into the Apollo program, Neil Armstrong and Jim Lovell and I were originally back up to the third Apollo flight. Jim was advanced to the prime crew, and the mission was switched to the second Apollo mission, which became Apollo 8, and its mission without a lander became the first flight to orbit around the moon 10 times during December of 1968. It was really a very challenging and very intriguing mission to be on the backup crew, to be any part of that, because it was the first mission that was going to leave the Earth and reach the moon. It was, to a large degree, a test of the navigation that the onboard navigator, in this case Jim Lovell, I was his backup, how well could we navigate in the event that the Deep Space Tracking Network was not able to give us the tracking that we felt they certainly could. If we lost communications, then we would have to navigate with the sextant. And it was very tedious making many, many measurements of the angle between star and moon horizon, or the star and Earth horizon, to then feed that into the computer and to have it give you a safe return to Earth trajectory.
Tell us what it was like when you found out you were selected, you were going to the moon.
Well, being on the backup crew for Apollo 8, the first flight that went to the moon, while that flight was underway in December of '68, there already was a prime and backup crew for Apollo 9 and Apollo 10. Apollo 9 would test the lunar lander in Earth orbit, and if that was successful, then Apollo 10 would do a dress rehearsal testing the lander, doing everything except the landing in lunar orbit. So we knew that if the sequence went as it previously did, that we would be in position to be on the crew of Apollo 11, going from the backup crew of 8 to the primary crew of Apollo 11. And in January, it was announced that that was the case.
What was your feeling?
Well, there's one of sort of great relief that the selection formality was made, but now there's great uncertainty of training for that mission, anticipating, of course, the success of the major portions of the next two flights. And as they unfolded successfully, we got closer and closer to realizing that indeed we would be given the opportunity, a very, very fortunate opportunity, to make the first human landing on the moon.
Any self-doubts?
I don't think there were self-doubts. There was a self-challenge to be as businesslike, as dedicated to doing the very best that we possibly could, to understanding the training, understanding what was needed, preparing ourselves in the different simulations to be able to respond correctly to the normal procedures and to any emergencies that might come up.
So you were well rehearsed then?
I think we were reasonably well rehearsed. I say reasonably, you could always keep training and training and training and be a little bit sharper. We did have a deadline. I guess it was maybe 3 weeks before before our launch in July of 1969. Maybe it's less than that. We were asked if we felt we needed another month of training so that we could go in August, and we felt we were reasonably ready to be able to take on the mission as scheduled. At the time, we weren't real sure why we were asked that question. I'm pretty sure it had to do with the fact that the Russian rocket had had an unsuccessful launch, not maybe 2 weeks before. I think it was very early in July that their N-1 rocket was on a test flight, quite assuredly an unmanned flight, but it didn't make it into space. And so that gave us a little more breathing room. But if we went in July and were not able to successfully land, then there were at least 2 more opportunities before the end of 1969. And when we did succeed in landing, then they delayed Apollo 12 from September or October until a November launch, I think it was. And they were successful, of course, also.
What was the training regimen like? What was a typical day for an astronaut on that mission?
I don't think there was a typical day of training. We knew what we were going to be doing. We would be in a simulator working the computer, and at the same time we were designing the patch insignia. And I remember one day we went into the command module to do some computer activities, and we asked the crew of instructors that were training us. We said, "What do you think of this Apollo 11 insignia of the eagle about to land on the moon?" And one of the instructors said, "Well, why don't you have the eagle carry an olive branch?" Well, that really made the big difference, and that made me feel so much more satisfied that we had selected such a symbolic patch for Apollo 11, carrying the olive branch apiece, because we already knew that this was an open program, and we were doing this in complete view of the rest of the world. And as a matter of fact, the plaque on the moon stated that we came in peace for all mankind, and so the olive branch was a very appropriate symbol.
What was it like the night before you left?
I don't think anyone slept all that well the night before. You know, you have a big day ahead of you, and you've been training and resting, and you probably are not all that tired. You're sort of keyed up, but we slept a certain amount, and then we got up and went through the various processes. We had plenty of time. I remember that somehow I lost a ring that I wanted to carry with me, so I delayed putting the gloves on till the very last minute. Somebody found the ring that had come off, and I wiped my hands, and so right at the last minute I was able to put that ring on before we had to suit up completely and put the gloves on to get in the van and go out to the launch pad.
Did you talk to your parents, particularly your father, the night before or the day before? Did he give you any advice?
Well, I felt my father probably would have given me advice, but I wasn't sure that he really understood all the details of what we were going through. So rather than maybe put him on the spot, as best I can recall, we just went about our activities. We had a chance to talk to our families the night before, of course, but once we got up in the morning, it was pretty serious business.
Now, as I understand it, President Nixon had drafted a response in case the mission did not go well and the 3 of you did not come back. Did you know that beforehand?
No, we didn't, but when that news came out sometime within the last year, I think maybe it was around the 30th anniversary of our landing, that someone finally uncovered that from the archives. It was not at all surprising. I would expect a leader of a nation about to do something like that would have his staff prepare him for the various eventualities. Of course, we all remember that Eisenhower prepared some remarks. Probably he prepared it himself before D-Day in the event that it didn't work out the way he had hoped. So it's not surprising that that people in positions of great responsibility and authority rely on their staff to assist them in preparing appropriate remarks, rather than one individual having to come up with the response to either a great success or to a tragedy.
Take us through that day a little bit. Take us through everything from that morning to getting into Apollo 11 to the liftoff. Take us through what all of that was like. You have a perspective that almost nobody else does, and for the billions of people who haven't been there, who haven't gone through this, it's kind of a mystery. It's an amazing mystery, and we're looking for some sort of insight into what that was all like.
Well, a few things stand out. We got up in the morning and had breakfast with the backup crew, and before we went in to get suited up, we did have a few words with the administrator of NASA at that time, Tom Paine. After that time, I grew to really admire him tremendously, because after I left NASA, I worked very closely with him in Southern California. But he got us aside and said, now I want you to be very, very careful, and don't take any unnecessary risks in this flight of yours to land on the moon. And if it just doesn't seem right, why, come on back and I'll see that you're put on the next mission. Well, that was a very reassuring thing for him to say, but I doubt very much if that would have set too well with the crew that was assigned to the next mission, that was ready to go and make the first landing. But it was certainly a reassuring thing to us. I'm not sure that it went through my mind or through Neil's mind as we got closer and closer, that if we decided we didn't have enough fuel to land and went on back, that's okay, we'll be on the next mission.
How was it finally decided who the first person to walk on the moon was going to be? Was that a NASA decision? Did you guys figure that out among yourselves, or how was that decided?
It certainly wasn't left up to us. It's rather a long story, but before crews were selected, there were various timelines laid out by different people. I know Jack Schmidt and I worked on some timelines, and at that time, I'm not sure exactly what it was, but one thing I wanted to have into the flight plan was, as soon as we landed, that we would go through a preparation for launch the next time that the command module came over, or 2 hours later. It had been 5 days at least since one had gone through the training for a very critical liftoff and rendezvous, and that the first thing on the moon probably was to get settled and to then go through the countdown as if you might actually have to lift off if there were any leaks or anything after touchdown. Things of that nature were outlined in procedures before crews were actually selected. And there was a history of spacewalking that set somewhat of a precedent in all of the spacewalking activities in the Gemini program and in Apollo. It was not the commander who did the spacewalk, but it was the junior person. Even on Apollo 9, the commander of the mission did not do the spacewalks. The other two people did. The lunar module pilot and the command module pilot were the ones who demonstrated some of the emergency procedures. So there were precedents that would lead one to think that the very severe training workload required of the commander for the launch from the surface of the Earth, for the en route decisions, for the landing itself, and then the liftoff from the moon were all very intense requirements for training that only the commander went through in great detail. So to then have him be the person who was doing more activities on the surface, there was an argument that said it might be better to have the junior person do more of the activities out on the surface. A decision was not being made because of the different factions that you can imagine was going on within the astronaut group, commanders and lunar module pilots, but a decision was not made until rather late. So I felt that we needed a decision, and it was not forthcoming. So I asked the head of the Apollo program office if we could have a decision soon, and to make sure that if we made a decision that it would not be changed at all. And that was maybe 5 or 6 weeks, I think, before launch. And we did have a decision, and in retrospect, it was very clear that it was the way that it should have been decided, because of the great emphasis that the public and the press and the media put on the first person to do this is always given such great more attention. And it just would not have been appropriate for the commander to have stayed in the lunar module while the junior person went out and did this great symbolic things of stepping out onto the lunar surface first. But we didn't really know those things, and we were a very competitive group of people, and I felt it was the natural thing to put forth the points of view that represented where I was coming from, and I did that. Some people didn't appreciate that coming from a fortunate, in the right place at the right time, academic egghead with combat record, but I wasn't a Navy carrier pilot. There were lots of differences between the astronauts, and it was a very competitive group of people. And some people were going to come out more favorable in the way that the selection process went, not necessarily because of their talents, but because it just had to be a decision made. Somebody had to be picked one way or the other.
What was it like, your first step on the moon?
Wouldn't want to say it was a letdown. I could very well see, looking from my window, that it was very easy for Neil to walk around and to scoop up a contingency sample. And then when I got down, it was really as expected. It was easier to move around on the surface than I guess we had thought it would be. But still, we wanted to, exercise a thorough understanding of the mobility, the balance. And later during the spacewalk, in front of the TV camera, so that people back here, I sort of jogged back and forth, showing different mobility ways of 2 feet at a time, one in front of the other, turning. And I was having a good time, but I was really doing that for the benefit of people here to get a very qualitative indication of what the mobility was like and how easy it was to move.
My 7-year-old wants to know, was it hard to walk around? Did you feel like you were tripping, or wasn't it difficult to walk on the moon?
It was really very easy. The combination of the restricted mobility of the pressure suit, which would keep your legs and arms from moving very rapidly, the combination of that restriction and the reduced gravity gave the overall impression of slow motion. whatever you were doing just was not going to happen as fast up there as it does down here. If you lean a little bit, you don't begin to lose your balance quickly at all. It's very, very slow, and it's very easy to recover.
Read accounts from various astronauts that say if you weren't spiritual before you went up in space, you were afterwards. Did you feel the same way? Did you feel that there was an indication then that there is a God?
Well, I felt it was appropriate to be, let's say, spiritually prepared as I went through training. It was natural. I was an elder in the Presbyterian Church, and I felt there were maybe some things I could do. So I inquired and got permission to serve myself communion when we were on the moon. Because I felt this was an indication of celebration or giving thanks. My ego came out, and I wanted people to know what I was doing because I felt good about it. But I was advised not to make mention of that over the radio, and I understood that, and in retrospect, it was certainly the appropriate thing to do because that was a rather secular thing. Since coming back from the moon, I've been greatly impressed with how fortunate a few of us were to be a part of such a program. But I don't think it has given me, the trip at least, has given me any greater insight. I've had a growing, maturing appreciation of spirituality and perhaps a lessening of the individual religious nature that seems to attract many, many humans. I think there's a much grander, much larger, bigger picture. Maybe it's an Einsteinian view of spirituality.
In one of your books, you mentioned that after it was all over with and you were in the decontamination process, you looked at Neil Armstrong and said, "My God, Neil, we missed it all." You realized what a big event it was and the way the world had reacted, and you, I guess, had been so busy doing what you had been trained to do that you felt like you had missed it in a way?
Well, that's not exactly what I felt the moment we got back onto the carrier, right after we'd gone through a physical exam and taken a shower and so forth. We watched some film before the ceremonies on the carrier. We watched some TV footage of the recordings of the broadcasters when we landed safely on the moon, and we saw the reaction of people around the moon and around the Earth in different parts, and that's when I just felt the urge to say to Neil, "Look at that. We missed the whole thing." In a way, making a joke, but also making a serious observation. It's sort of a mixture of the two. And I'm not sure exactly what prompted me to say that. Since then, I think what it was the realization that the response that we were seeing around the world was a measure of the value of what we had just done. Much more so than the rocks that we brought back or what anybody said or the questions that were answered. It was that for those brief moments, those minutes, those hours of the successful landing and then the walk on the moon, this was something that was shared worldwide in a way that could never again be repeated. And it did bring the world together, and they paused and they forgot about other things that were happening for a brief moment. And the individuals, the humans around the world, treasure that moment as something that was meaningful in their lives. And for the most part, it is so etched in their memory that they remember where they were during those moments.
Let's talk about the last 30 years in the future of space also. I think it's most people's, the general public's imagination or mindset that the landing on the moon in 1969 was pretty much the epitome of the space program, and there hasn't been that much that's been notable since then. How do you dissuade them of that?
Well, it certainly was the objective that we set forth. There was a competitiveness that started even before Sputnik. After Sputnik in 1957, it was greatly magnified. And then it became clear that we were being challenged in achievements in the technology of rocketry and spaceflight by the Soviets. They had the first person to fly in space. We couldn't match that until almost a year later. But by that time, we had accepted the challenge that would spur together and make a commitment. So much of the 60s was involved in that competitiveness and that measuring of how well we're proceeding toward our objective. And for that period of time, when one achieves that, then there is a sense of a letdown, maybe not with the participants who are going to go on the next flight and the next flight, and then things go wrong on Apollo 13, and then we have successful missions. But for the public at large, there was a significant distraction by the events going on in Southeast Asia and the differences of opinion of people about the appropriateness of the government's actions. And few people want to remember it, but I will remind them that right after we got out of quarantine, one of our first appearances was to receive the Pierre Marquette Discovery Medal at Marquette in Wisconsin, I think it was. And when we were there were students demonstrating, and they chose that opportunity to throw eggs at us, having just come back from the moon. Now that sounds like a very inappropriate thing, but that was the sense of what was going on during those times. There was a great division. When we flew the last missions to the moon and had underway already something to do with the Apollo equipment, the Apollo rockets and spacecraft, while we were waiting for the development of the next major program. And that was pretty much set in motion in 1971, before the last lunar mission. And that was the space shuttle. And the compromises that were involved in that were essentially put into effect by the end of 1961. The fact that we weren't going to have a two-stage fully reusable. Unfortunately, they wanted to put a cockpit in the booster, and I couldn't understand why that was that way. And that two-stage fully reusable became too expensive. So we went to the orbiter and the tank and the solid rockets. But by that time I had left NASA. I didn't see some of the wisdom that was in that, and I still don't see the wisdom that was in the cost savings by going with solid rockets. But what did happen was the what was called Apollo applications, or the Earth orbit laboratory of a solar laboratory in Skylab. And what I remark now, reflecting back on those days when I wasn't with NASA and didn't really appreciate it, it took the space station defined in 1984 and then revised in many ways. It was supposed to be ready within 10 years, and it still isn't complete and won't be until after 2004 or 5 or 6, and it's had to have been reduced in capacity and objectives quite a bit, and the cost has gone up considerably. So now I really appreciate what was done in Skylab with one launch of one big rocket that was very well tested, and we used the upper portion of that to use a volume that was a converted fuel tank. That became the pressure volume of the Skylab, and what put it into orbit was the second stage of the Saturn V, and when it got into orbit, there were very large hydrogen and oxygen tanks that were available, but we didn't need all that volume because there were only 3 people going to the space station. So we discarded that additional volume that was right there. Now, the next time we do something like that, which I believe we could and should do with the external tank and solid rockets without the orbiter, but engines, we should launch the core stage of the tank with additional volumes on top of that and put that into orbit, and then make use of the connected fuel tank of the external tank, the hydrogen tank, the oxygen tank, and 2 tanks above that. That should be the way we launch space stations of the future. As I see the transportation that's needed in the future, there are 2 major pillars, 2 things that need to be developed. One of them is this shuttle-derived large volume that also, when we're not interested in a volume, then we have heavy payloads that we can't launch with any of the expendable rockets of today. We need a much heavier rocket to send the cargo to the moon, or the cargo to Mars, or some of the Air Force orbital space-based lasers, or whatever they are. But we also need that same rocket to put up the volume that is existing in the tanks that go into orbit. So that's one pillar of the space transportation. And the other one is not high performance, but it is 2-stage to orbit. A progression of these 2-stage to orbit. We need a small, a medium, and a large. Here is an example of what I've been working on, which represents the medium size reusable booster and upper stages. What is unique about our selection of this is that, just like the jet airplanes of the early 50s, where the tail section would come off and you could take the jet engine out and put a new one in, an overhauled one in, put the airplane back together and fly it. Why? Because the jet engines were not reliable as they should be. They're much more reliable today. Rocket engines of today are not as reliable as they should be. Therefore, what we've done is to have the rocket separate from the airframe. This is an Atlas III rocket, very lightweight, thin-skinned, and it's got a new Russian engine in it. So we put that in 2 airplanes. This is a dual booster, which increases the payload. We could use one of these with the smaller rocket, or 2 of these with the smaller rocket, or this one can put about 6 tons into orbit. And of course, the booster separates, and it's unmanned, of course. This is just a booster, and these are existing solid rockets and Centaur rockets and payload fairings. But this can put about 6 tons to geosynchronous transfer orbit, which is a very, very admirable payload. We have a bigger rocket that could be used in the middle of this. And eventually, what we can do is to have one of these boosters fly with an orbiter. Now that orbiter, in our way of thinking, should have hydrogen on the outside. This is a kerosene rocket in the booster, but it's a hydrogen rocket in the orbiter, the same shape, but the hydrogen is outside and the oxygen is inside. So this separates at about Mach 5 or 6, and unmanned comes back with jet engines, flies back and lands, and this, of course, goes into orbit. It's about half the size of the present orbiter, and it delivers only crew to orbit. And of course, an interesting feature is that it has a crew module that separates so that the crew can be safely aborted from this at any time during the rocket launch.
Implicit in all of this, though, is that NASA really can't do this. It has to be done through private industry now, and that's where the rub always comes in.
It would be wonderful if NASA didn't have to do this, if private industry could do this, and we could just say, they will do it. The fact of the matter is they won't do it because there's not the payoff return. It has to be government pioneered in the development of it. We've learned that now when the single stage X-33 has been canceled, that there just is no way that industry is going to be able to get the investment money from Wall Street to do this. We will need to upgrade the present shuttle in a gradual evolutionary fashion and eventually have a larger version of this booster. This is a medium booster. A larger version of this would replace the solid rocket boosters on the shuttle. And that larger version, using 2 of them on the present shuttle, would then use 1 booster with the orbiter, and that would replace the crew and cargo capacity of the present orbiter. And the civil version of that could now have crew and passengers, 60, 80, maybe 100, some number like that allows an economical business to be made of the civil versions of what NASA needs to replace its present shuttle. So there's a partnership needed in the development of a government need that also has spin-offs. Now, we've seen that happen before. Back in the early 50s, the Air Force had a B-47 and a B-52 jet bombers, but they just had a KC-97 propeller tanker. They needed a jet tanker to refuel these jet bombers. But it was going to be expensive to develop that, but Boeing saw that if they could develop a tanker that also had the characteristics of being a civil jet liner. At that time, all of our airlines were flying propeller airplanes. Mm-hmm. It was not a jet airline business. But the KC-135 jet tanker was developed, and at the same time, the Boeing 707, the first jet airliner. So there was a dual purpose of development of that, and that ushered in the jet age of airline travel. That's what's needed, a partnership, but we have to move there in incremental steps. So the 2 pillars of space transportation are large volume and heavy lift, starting with the external tank and the solid rockets, and eventually replacing the solid rockets with flyback boosters. But that's one pillar. The other is 2-stage to orbit, booster and orbiter.
The question is, though, this will still take tens of billions of dollars of public money, and you have people who are screaming for more money for education, for the military, for military salaries, for 8 million different reasons. Why is space travel, space exploration so important to the public good that tens of billions of dollars spent on this is more valuable than tens of billions of dollars spent on education or health?
There will always be the arguments that we could, instead of spending this on space, which we don't need, we could spend it back here. The fact of the matter is that the military does need to upgrade the ability to secure our assets in space. The U.S. has more satellites, and we have become more dependent upon satellites for our security, our communication, worldwide security. Those assets need to be protected. We need to defend ourselves against missile attacks. A number of these things have been sort of set aside. We need to catch up. These are the kinds of launch vehicles that is needed for the national security of our country. The competitiveness of our delivery of the civilian rockets needs to be competitive with the increasing efficiencies of the French Ariane rockets. When the Challenger accident occurred, just before that, the U.S. launched about 90% of the Western world's payloads. After the Challenger accident, almost 3 years later, that had decreased down to about 60 or 50%. It's still down around it, but the French have a new rocket that is meeting its cost objectives, And we, on the contrast, have expendable rockets that may not quite meet their cost objectives. We need to have an active upgrading of the next generation system of rockets. Otherwise, we will not be competitive in the world. Now, the Chinese rockets are getting better and better, and of course the Russian rockets are very good, and they're based on a system that can reduce the cost down below what we could do. So we need to be competitive in that market. And I think we also deserve to the young people of our country to be leaders in the world of exploration in space. There's no reason why we can't have people return to the moon in 15 years about, and human explorers, not tourists, but explorers, going to Mars, but only if we as a nation make a commitment that when we go to Mars, we're going to go there and not just do it 2 or 3 times and then stop, but we're going to go to Mars and have a gradual buildup of a permanent presence of a settlement on Mars. Sooner or later, a responsible civilization owes it to future generations to ensure the survival of humanity here on Earth. And you can never tell when something might come from outer space that we can't react against to prevent from a catastrophe happening here on Earth that could conceivably wipe out the human race unless we have a growing settlement somewhere. Now, whether that should be done by 2025 or 2050 or 2100 or 2200 or just when it should be, I think it is a growing realization that things can happen in this universe of ours that we don't have any control over. Whether we know whether there's life somewhere else or not, we owe it to our civilization to ensure its survival.
So you really think the survival of humanity really depends on space exploration? Continued?
I think it eventually does, yes. Plus the opportunities for the resources that are in the asteroids to bring back to make up for the depletion of the use of resources here on the surface of the Earth. And I think breakthroughs in energy can make space travel much more cost-effective and efficient. But the most important thing is we need to increase the reliability of the rockets that we have. 1 in 20 failure for expendable rockets is not very good. We need to make that 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. And the best way to do that is to bring that rocket engine back after it's flown and look at it and examine it and find out where the failures are about to happen. And that means reusability. And we must break through this reusability barrier. We must be able to afford to invest in that. If the payload that is going into orbit is not large enough, if we don't have a high enough volume, then it's difficult to build the business case for investing in the wings and wheels to bring the rocket. We might as well just throw them away if you look at it from that economic position. But if you have a vision for the future and you realize that in order to have an efficient system that's highly reliable, we have to have reusability. Then the one payload that gives us high volume traffic is people. And that's why I'm convinced that building a delivery system and a place to go to, a quarters in space, where people can go for about a week at a time, and a delivery system that can take not 10 people once a month, but 50, 60, 80 people every other day. That's a lot of people, but that is what ballpark is needed to be able to charge people initially less than $1 million and then closer and closer to $100,000. But still, that's very expensive. So 10 or 12 years ago, I realized we must do something else to broaden out the opportunities. And a lottery or a game show selection or some sponsorship, a method of selecting people other than how much money they have to invest in a ride into space. We need something of that nature. When the rides are few and far between, 2 or 3 a year, then we can have an entertainment type selection or a sponsorship and an extensive training. But when we're flying people quite frequently, then we need something that has a rapid selection. And I think that's where we need to move into something like a sweepstakes or a lottery to make it available to more than just those with great means.
Do you have any qualms or any fears about the military use of space?
I really don't. I don't. I have qualms about other nations' military using space to our disadvantage. I'm not concerned about the military-industrial complex becoming overly aggressive because of activities in space. Not at all. The military is in space now with reconnaissance that gives us information, great information about the capabilities of other nations. And we need to improve that. We need to improve our ability to protect our satellites, our assets. We need to put more detection devices that can act to discover when aggressive launches occur so that we can react to that appropriately.
When all is said and done, how does Buzz Aldrin want to be remembered?
When I was young, I remember my father and early pioneers talking about the good old days, and somehow it seemed a little sad that they were always looking backward. Maybe that or something else, a spark of creativity, a desire to want to do things better. I believe that in the last 30 years, at least the last 20, and especially the last 10 or 5, I have developed a greater appreciation for what I think is the evolutionary direction that I think our nation should go. We can improve on that as we go along, but we need to make some progressive commitments. And I think those commitments need to be somehow in sync with the term of office of the Commander-in-Chief. It's the President who decides the direction of the nation's efforts in space. And those potentially change every 4 years, or at least go through a review and a recommitment. So I think we need successive 4-year programs, maybe 5 or 6 of them. And the further they are in the future, the more uncertain they are. But the ones that you commit yourself to right now are very definite, and then you revise those as you go along. And I would like to be known as a person who introduces visionary, evolutionary concepts to improve our nation and the world's space travel opportunities.
Well, Dr. Aldrin, I think everybody would agree that you certainly are that person. Thank you very much, sir.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The first stage of the Apollo 11 Saturn V, designated S1C6 for the 6th flight stage, arrived at the Kennedy Space Center on February 20th, 1969. Because of their large size, Saturn V stages were shipped to the Kennedy Space Center by ocean-going vessels and specially designed aircraft. The Saturn V was the first large vehicle in the U.S. space program to be conceived and designed for a specific purpose, that of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The birth of the Saturn V can be dated to January 10, 1962, when NASA formally announced development of the Big Booster. The 300,000-pound first stage is 33 feet in diameter and 138 feet long. At liftoff, It held nearly 4.5 million pounds of propellant, consisting of E1, a form of kerosene for fuel, and liquid oxygen as oxidizer. The first stage generated a total thrust of around 7.5 million pounds, operating for just 2 to lift the vehicle to an altitude of about 38 miles at burnout. The awesome power of the Saturn V first stage was generated by 5 F1 engines. Each F1 engine was a single-start, 1.5 million pound fixed thrust engine. All of the engines were identical, with one exception. The outer 4 swiveled or gimbaled for steering control. The center engine was fixed. The expense of the Saturn V makes it imperative that no effort be spared to assure that it will perform as expected in flight. The magnitude of the Saturn V ground test program was unprecedented. To qualify for flight, all components and systems had to meet standards deliberately set much higher than actually required. The inspection to which flight hardware was subjected was thorough. X-rays were used to inspect fusion welds, 100 castings and 5,000 transistors and diodes. A quarter mile of welding and 5 miles of tubing were inspected with the use of ultrasonics. The same type of inspection was given to adhesive bonds, which are equivalent in area to an acre. An electrical current inspection method was used on 6 miles of tubing, and dye-penetrant tests were run on 2.5 miles of welding. Each contractor had its own test program that was patterned to a basic conservative approach. Qualification testing of parts, subassemblies, and assemblies was performed to assure that they are capable of meeting flight requirements. Reliability analysis was conducted to determine the range of failures or margins of error in each component. A battleship test stage constructed more solidly than a flight stage was used to prove major design parameters. The stage verified propellant loading, tank and feed operation, and engine firing techniques. Battleship testing was followed by all systems testing. Finished work undergoes functional checkout to ensure it meets requirements. Fluid-carrying components are subjected to pressures beyond normal operating requirements. Rocket engines were static-fired before delivery to the stage contractor, and each stage underwent testing leading to a full-power captive acceptance firing. After refurbishment and a post-firing checkout, it was shipped to Kennedy Space Center. Upon arriving and being offloaded at the dock, the stage would enter a low bay of the VAB, or Vehicle Assembly Building. The VAB consists of a high bay area 525 feet tall, a low bay area 210 feet tall, and a 4-story launch control center connected to the high bay by an enclosed bridge. There are 4 assembly and checkout bays in the high bay area. The low bay contained 8-stage preparation and checkout cells equipped with systems that simulated stage interfaces. Saturn V stages went into the VAB low bay area where preparation and checkout began. After being towed into the high bay area and positioned under the 250-ton overhead crane, slings were attached to the first stage and attached to the crane. The stage is lifted to a vertical orientation and then positioned over the mobile launcher. At this stage in the process, the first stage is still missing the engine nozzle extensions and fairings and fins. These will be added later. The VAB had 141 different lifting devices at the time of the Saturn V, ranging from 1-ton mechanical hoists to 2 250-ton high bay bridge cranes. Each pair of high bays shares a bridge crane. The cranes have a lifting range of 456 feet and a travel distance of 431 feet. When the stage is positioned over the mobile launcher, it is lowered into place. Then it is secured to 4 hold-down and support arms. These support the entire space vehicle during launch preparation and provide hold-down during thrust buildup prior to launch. The second stage for the Apollo 11 Saturn V S-26 arrived at Kennedy Space Center on February 9, 1969. On the Saturn V, the second stage employed cryogenic propellants of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. For the lunar mission, the second stage takes over from the first stage at an altitude of about 38 miles and boosts its payload of the Saturn V third stage and the Apollo spacecraft to approximately 114 miles. When its 5 J2 engines ignite, the stage is pushing more than 1 million pounds. Speed of the stage ranges from 6,000 miles per hour to 15,300 miles per hour. The beginning of the second stage boost is a two-step process. When all the F1 engines of the first stage have cut off, the first stage separates. Ullage rocket motors around the base of the second stage then fire for approximately 4 seconds to give positive acceleration to the stage prior to engine ignition. About 30 seconds after the first stage separation, the part of the second stage structure on which the Ullage rockets are located, the aft interstage, is separated by firing explosive charges. This second separation is a precise maneuver. The 18-foot-high interstage must slip past the engines without touching them. With the stages traveling at great speed, the interstage must clear the engines by only a little more than 3 feet. The second stage burns for about 6 minutes, pushing its payload into space. The 81-foot second stage is basically a container for its 942,000 pounds of propellant, with engines attached at the bottom. Propellants represent more than 90% of the stage's flight weight. The stage is constructed mostly of lightweight aluminum alloys ribbed in such a fashion that it is rigid enough to endure the pressures to which it is subjected. Special lightweight insulation had to be developed to keep its cryogenic propellants from warming. The second stage developed its power through 5 Rocketdyne J2 engines, a high-performance upper-stage propulsion system. Each engine developed a maximum vacuum thrust of 225,000 pounds. All J2 engines were identical when delivered. They all were designed to be restarted in flight. The restart capability is only used in the third stage. As in the first stage, the outer 4 engines in the second stage gimbal, while the center engine is fixed. The second stage of the Apollo 11 Saturn V was erected at the top of the first stage on March 4, 1969. Using the 250-ton bridge crane, the stage was lifted into position with the aft interstage attached. The Apollo 11 Saturn V's third stage was moved into the VAB for checkout on January 21, 1969. The Saturn V third stage was an oxygen-hydrogen stage derived from the S4 stage originally created as part of the Saturn I program. The S4B stage was also used as the second stage for the Saturn 1B. The third stage had a maximum thrust on one J2 engine of 225,000 pounds. The stage was used for the final Earth orbital insertion and reignited to place the Apollo spacecraft on a translunar trajectory. The stage burned for about 2 3/4 minutes for orbital insertion and about 5.5 minutes for translunar injection.
Ignition. We confirm ignition and the thrust is go.
Guidance looking good. Velocity 26,000 feet per second. Cut off. We're showing velocity 35,570 feet per second, altitude 177 nautical miles.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. We show cutoff and we copy the numbers in noun 62. Apollo 11, Houston, do you read? Apollo 11, this is Houston. Do you read, over?
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. We're reading the VI of 35579er, and the EMS was plus 3.3, over.
Roger, plus 3.3 on the EMS.
Because the stage was a part of the vehicle for an extended period of time, it contained an auxiliary propulsion module for attitude control. Two APS modules were mounted 180 degrees apart on the aft skirt assembly. Each module contained three 150-pound thrust engines and one 70-pound thrust ullage motor. The Apollo 11 third stage, with its aft interstage, was placed above Stage 2 on March 5, 1969. The instrument unit is the Saturn V's nerve center. It contains the electronic and electrical equipment needed for guidance, tracking, and communications of vehicle environmental and performance data. The IU also contains environmental control equipment for temperature control, batteries, and power supplies to furnish operating power for electronic equipment. The stage structure is 260 inches in diameter and 36 inches high and becomes a load-bearing part of the vehicle. It supports the components within the IU and the weight of the spacecraft. Several tracking systems are used to follow vehicle trajectory during ascent and orbit. Vehicle antennas and transponders, which increase ground-based tracking systems' range and accuracy, make up the IU's tracking equipment. The Saturn V is equipped with lots of equipment designed to detect malfunctions. Some of this equipment checks engine thrust and monitors guidance computer status, attitude rates, angle of attack, and abort request. This emergency detection information is flashed to the IU, where it is routed to the emergency detection distributor in the electrical system. In the case of an emergency, the system will turn on a light in front of the astronauts. If the spacecraft abort selector switch is in the automatic abort position, the abort will take place without further crew participation. The action cannot be vetoed by the astronauts. However, if the selector switch is in the manual position, the crew makes the decision when to abort a mission. The Apollo 11 lunar module, LM-5, was designated as Eagle by the crew. The lunar module is a two-stage vehicle designed for space operations near and on the Moon. The LM is not capable of re-entering the atmosphere and was the first manned spacecraft designed solely for operation in space. The lunar module stands 22 feet 11 inches high and is 31 feet wide diagonally across the landing gear. Joined by 4 explosive bolts and umbilicals, the ascent and descent stages of the LM operate as a unit until staging, when the ascent stage functions as a single spacecraft for rendezvous and docking with a CSM. 3 main sections make up the ascent stage: the crew compartment, midsection, and the aft equipment bay. Only the crew compartment and midsection are pressurized at 4.8 pounds per square inch. The cabin volume is 235 cubic feet. The descent stage consists of a cruciform load-carrying structure of 2 pairs of parallel beams, upper and lower decks, and enclosure bulkheads. The center compartment houses the descent engine, and descent propellant tanks are housed in the 4 square bays around the engine. The descent stage measures 10 feet 7 inches high by 14 feet 1 inch in diameter. In a retracted position until after the crew mans the LM, the landing gear struts are explosively extended and provide lunar surface landing impact absorption. The main struts are filled with crushable aluminum honeycomb for absorbing compression loads. Footpads 37 inches in diameter at the end of the landing gear provide support on the surface. Each pad except the forward pad is fitted with a lunar surface sensing probe which signals the crew to shut down the descent engine upon contact with the lunar surface. Eagle had a launch weight of 33,205 pounds. CSM-107, Apollo 11's Command and Service Module spacecraft, was designated as Columbia by the crew. It consisted of a service module 12 feet 10 inches in diameter and 24 feet 7 inches high. For the Apollo 11 mission, it weighed 51,243 pounds at launch. Aluminum honeycomb panels 1 inch thick form the outer skin, and milled aluminum radial beams separate the interior into 6 sections around a central cylinder containing 2 helium spheres, 4 sections containing service propulsion system fuel and oxidizer tankage, another containing fuel cells, cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen, and 1 section essentially empty. The service propulsion system provided thrust for large spacecraft velocity changes through a gimbal-mounted 20,500-pound thrust hypergolic engine using a nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer and a 50-50 mixture of unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and hydrazine fuel. The command module is a pressure vessel encased in heat shields, cone-shaped 11 feet 5 inches high with a base diameter of 12 feet 10 inches and a launch weight of 12,250 pounds. The command module consists of the forward compartment, which contains 2 reaction control engines and components of the Earth landing system, the crew compartment or inner pressure vessel containing crew accommodations, controls and displays, and many of the spacecraft systems, and the aft compartment housing 10 reaction control engines, propellant tankage, helium tanks, water tanks, and the CSM umbilical connection. The crew compartment contained 210 cubic feet of habitable volume. The command module Earth landing system includes the drogue and main parachute system, as well as post-landing recovery aids. In a normal entry descent, the command module forward heat shield is jettisoned at 24,000 feet, permitting mortar deployment of 2 reefed 16.5-foot diameter drogue parachutes for orienting and decelerating the spacecraft. After drogue release, 3 mortar-deployed pilot chutes pull out the 3 main 83-foot diameter parachutes with 2-stage reefing to provide gradual inflation in 3 steps. 2 main parachutes out of 3 can provide a safe landing.
Apollo 11, Houston, you're a go for TEI, over. Apollo 11, thank you.
This is Apollo Control at 134 hours, 48 minutes. It continues very quiet here in Mission Control. The flight controllers have been observing the crew inputs to their computer, monitoring as the crew prepares for the trans-Earth injection burn, scheduled to occur at about 35 minutes from now. This is Apollo Control. We're now less than 30 seconds from the time at which trans-Earth injection is scheduled, the burn to start Apollo 11 on its trajectory back to Earth. We're now 15 seconds from the scheduled ignition time. That burn will last about 2 minutes, 28 seconds and consume 10,000 pounds of propellant. And the crew should be burning at this time. Of course, that maneuver is performed on the backside of the moon. We have no data from the spacecraft here in Mission Control at this time. We won't know how the burn went for about another 10 minutes, which is the time at which we're scheduled to reacquire Apollo 11.
AOS.
And there's the cue. We have acquisition of signal.
Hello, Apollo 11, Houston, how did it go, over? Time to open up the LRL doors, Charlie. Roger, we got you coming home. It's well stocked.
At launch, the lunar module is housed in the spacecraft Lunar Module Adapters section. This is a truncated cone 28 feet long extending from the top of the instrument unit to the bottom of the service module. The entire assembly of CSM, LEM, and spacecraft Lunar Module Adapter are assembled, moved to the VAB, and erected atop the 3rd stage of the launch vehicle.
There she goes. It was a good one. Roger, Dodger. We got Eagle looking good. It's holding cabin pressure, and it picked up about 2 feet per second from that jettison. I believe that. I can see some cracks in outer coating around the tunnel. In the thermal protective coverage, I don't think it has anything to do with structure. Roger. Hello, Columbia, Houston. We'll have a attitude and a little blip burn for you at about 130.30 so we can separate from Eagle, over. That's fine. Columbia, Houston, would you start a maneuver to about pitch of 230 for this little tweak burn, over? Roger, pitch 230. Roger, Mike, can verify track mode in auto for the high gain.
The crewmen of Apollo 11 spent more than 5 hours of formal crew training for each hour of the mission's 8-day duration. This training included detailed briefings on spacecraft systems, operation and modifications, Saturn launch vehicle briefings on countdown, range safety, flight dynamics, failure modes, and abort conditions. Briefings were held and continuous training done on mission photographic objectives and use of camera equipment. Stowage reviews and practice in training sessions in the spacecraft mock-ups and command module simulators allowed the crewmen to evaluate spacecraft stowage of crew-associated equipment. More than 400 hours of training per man in command module and lunar module simulators were conducted, along with entry corridor deceleration profiles at lunar return conditions in the centrifuge. Lunar surface briefings and 1G walkthroughs of lunar surface EVA operations were conducted. In addition, the crew became familiar with the flight hardware through visits to the manufacturing facilities and through altitude chamber runs with both spacecraft. In these runs, the spacecraft were placed in a condition simulating flight pressure. The mobile launcher is a transportable launch base and umbilical tower for the space vehicle. 3 mobile launchers were used at Launch Complex 39. The launcher base is a 2-story steel structure, 25 feet high, 160 feet long, and 135 feet wide. It is positioned on 6 steel pedestals 22 feet high, both in the VAB and at the launch pad. At the launch pad, the launcher was also stiffened by 4 extendable columns designed to counter rebound loads if the Saturn engines cut off. The umbilical tower, extending 398 feet above the launch platform, is mounted on one end of the launcher base. A hammerhead crane at the top has a hook height of 376 feet above the deck. The 12 million pound mobile launcher stands 445 feet high when resting on its pedestals. The launch vehicle sits over a 45-foot square opening which allows an outlet for engine exhaust into the launch pad trench containing a flame deflector. This opening is lined with a replaceable steel blast shield, independent of the structure, and is cooled by a water curtain initiated 2 seconds after liftoff. There are 9 hydraulically operated service arms on the umbilical tower. These service arms support lines for the vehicle umbilical systems and provide access for personnel to the stages as well as the astronauts to the spacecraft. On Apollo 11, one of the service arms is retracted early in the count. The Apollo spacecraft access arm is partially retracted at T-minus 43 minutes. A third service arm is released at T-minus 30 seconds, and a fourth at about T-minus 16 seconds. The remaining 5 arms are set to swing back at vehicle first motion. The Apollo Access Arm, Service Arm 9, located at the 320-foot level above the launcher base, provides access to the spacecraft cabin for the closeout team and astronaut crews. The flight crew boards the spacecraft starting at about T-minus 2 hours 40 minutes. The Apollo 11 vehicle is secured to the mobile launcher by 4 combination support and hold-down arms mounted on the launcher deck. The hold-down arms are cast in one piece, about 6 by 9 feet at the base and 10 feet tall, weighing more than 20 tons. Damper struts secure the vehicle near the top. After the engines ignite, the arms hold Apollo 11 for about 6 seconds until the engines build up to 95% thrust. The arms release on receipt of a launch commit signal at the 0 mark in the count. The vehicle is prevented from accelerating too rapidly by controlled release devices. The 6 million pound transporters move mobile launchers into the VAB and mobile launchers with assembled Apollo space vehicles to the launch pad. They are also used to transport the mobile service structure to and from the launch pad. 2 crawler transporters were constructed and are still used today to transport space shuttle vehicles. Maximum speed of the transporter is about 1 mile per hour loaded. The 3.5-mile trip to Pad A with Apollo 11 took about 6 hours. The transporter has a leveling system designed to keep the top of the space vehicle vertical within plus or minus 10 minutes of arc, about the dimensions of a basketball. The system also provides leveling operations required to negotiate the 5% ramp which leads to the launch pad and keeps the load level when it is raised and lowered on pedestals. The transporter moves on a roadway almost as broad as an 8-laned highway and is designed to accommodate a combined weight of about 18 million pounds. The roadway was built in 3 layers with an average depth of 7 feet. The base layer is 2.5 feet of hydraulic fill. The next layer consists of 3 feet of crushed rock. The top is covered with a cover of river rock, 8 inches deep.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We're at T-minus 2 hours, 55 seconds and counting. We're approaching the 2-hour mark in our countdown, and we appear to be proceeding satisfactorily at this time. The crew aboard the spacecraft, the 320-foot level. The hatch is closed, and we're beginning to purge the cabin to bring it to the proper atmosphere full launch, which is a combination of oxygen and nitrogen, 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen atmosphere. Of course, the astronauts themselves are breathing pure oxygen through their spacesuits. Coming up shortly will be another key test in which both the launch crew for the launch vehicle crew and the spacecraft team combine together with the commander, Neil Armstrong, to make a thorough check of the emergency detection system. This is the system that will signal the astronauts in the cabin if anything goes wrong below them. We used a ground-based computer to accomplish this test. It's rather lengthy as these tests go using a computer. It will take some 30 minutes. Neil Armstrong will be doing most of the work in the spacecraft, responding as different cue lights signifying different difficulties are presented to him. The abort panel, of course, is across from the commander on the left-hand side, the left front of the spacecraft. Our countdown continuing, T-minus 1 hour, 59 minutes, 34 seconds, and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 1 hour, 50 minutes, 55 seconds, and counting. We're proceeding with the countdown for the Apollo 11 mission at this time, and it's going satisfactorily. At this point, the spacecraft commander, Neil Armstrong, in the process of working the emergency detection system test. This is working with the launch crew here in the firing room and also the spacecraft team in control rooms back at the Manned Spacecraft Operations building here at the Kennedy Space Center. All going well with the... We're flowing hydrogen back into the third stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle after having difficulty with that leaking valve. It appears that we are bypassing the use of the valve directly in loading the hydrogen aboard, but we are getting the hydrogen back in to replenish the supply. All appears to be going well at this time. Weather is go. We're coming up on 1 hour and 50 minutes. This is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. T-minus 1 hour, 40 minutes, 55 seconds, and counting. The countdown is still proceeding very satisfactory at this time as we lead up toward our planned liftoff time of 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight. The spacecraft commander, Neil Armstrong, continuing this extensive series of checks of the emergency detection system, working with both the launch vehicle test crew and the spacecraft crew. This is a key test and a very thorough test to assure ourselves before we commit to liftoff that all the emergency detection techniques inside the launch are operating properly here on the ground, so if required in flight, the spacecraft commander and, of course, his two fellow astronauts could be signaled of a difficulty inside the rocket and could take proper abort action as required. Thus far, the three astronauts aboard the spacecraft have just been giving business-like responses back to the directions and checks, working with the spacecraft conductor, Skip Chauvin, as he runs down his procedures as the countdown continues. For T-minus 1 hour, 39 minutes, 46 seconds and counting. This is Launch Control.
Yes, I do.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 1 hour, 30 minutes, 55 seconds and counting. All elements are... At this time, the countdown landing 2 astronauts on the moon. At this time, the spacecraft test conductor some checks with astronaut Mike Collins aboard the spacecraft. We're winding up this important emergency detection system test that Neil Armstrong has been participating in. Meanwhile, at the 320-foot level, the closeout crew now placing the boost protective cover over the hatch now that we have completed the cabin purge and have the proper environment inside the cabin. We have also performed leak checks to assure ourselves that the cabin atmosphere is valid. Protective cover is used during the early phases of the powered flight and is jettisoned with the escape tower shortly after second stage ignition. Here in the firing room, the launch vehicle test team still keeping a close eye on the status of the propellants aboard the Saturn V launch vehicle. We're back to 100% supply with the liquid hydrogen fuel in the third stage. This problem with the leaking valve is no problem at this time. We've actually bypassed the valve, but we are maintaining our hydrogen supply aboard the vehicle. All aspects go. The weather is very satisfactory for launch this morning. A thin cloud cover about 15,000 feet. Temperature at launch time expected to be about 85 degrees. T-minus 1 hour, seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. T-minus 1 hour, 20 minutes, 55 seconds and counting. All the countdown for Apollo 11 at this time. At this point in the countdown, spacecraft commander Neil Armstrong once again appears to be the busiest worker in the spacecraft as he's performing a series of alignment checks associated with the guidance system in the spacecraft. He's working these checks with the spacecraft test conductor as the spacecraft test conductor reads off the various procedures and Armstrong responds to them. The astronauts aboard the spacecraft conductor a short while ago that the launch vehicle is go at this time. The hydrogen problem that we did encounter earlier has been solved. That's real good news, said Armstrong, and then he went back to work shortly thereafter. We're now coming up on the 1 hour, 20-minute mark in the countdown. Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. T-minus 1 hour, 11 minutes, 55 seconds and counting. The countdown for Apollo 11 still going very satisfactorily at this time. In most cases, we're a matter of 5 or 10 minutes ahead of the countdown procedures. The crew in the White Room at the 320 this time are just in the process of finishing up their work. They've been advised by the spacecraft test conductor that they'll probably be able to move out in about 3 minutes or so. Once this is accomplished, once the closeout crew does depart, we'll be ready to move that swing arm back, swing arm 9. It will be moved 12 degrees away. This is about 5 feet away from the hatch. Once this is accomplished, we will arm the pyrotechnic systems in the spacecraft so in the event of a possible catastrophic condition below them with the launch vehicle, while still on the pad, the astronauts could fire that escape rocket and separate from the rocket in difficulty. The crew, closeout crew about to depart at this time. That swing arm remains about 12 degrees away from the spacecraft hatch, as mentioned, 5 feet or so, until the 5-minute mark in the count when it's fully retracted to its fallback position. The obvious reason here is in the event we do have to get the astronauts out in a hurry, the swing arm is in a standby position and can be moved rapidly back to the hatch level so the astronauts could depart in the event of an emergency. We're coming up on T-minus 1 hour, 10 minutes, and 20 seconds. This is Kennedy Launch. This is Apollo Launch Control at 1 hour, 7 minutes, 25 seconds and counting. Countdown still proceeding satisfactorily. For those people who would like to synchronize their watches in relation to the count, will synchronize on 26 minutes past the hour, which is now about 5 seconds away. We'll count down the last 5 seconds to 26 minutes past the hour. We're now 1 away from 20 past the hour. In the meantime, we do have information from the civil defense agencies in the area. The estimate is more than 1 million persons are in the immediate area in Brevard County to watch the launch. Now 40 seconds away from 26 minutes past the hour. Civil Defense Agency reports further that there is extensive heavy traffic, a number of traffic jams, particularly in the area of Titusville, near US 1 and Route 50. Countdown still progressing satisfactorily, 15 seconds away from 26 minutes. 5, 4, 3, 2, mark. 8:26 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We're now 1 hour, 5 minutes, 55 seconds and counting as it was announced at that point. This is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 61 minutes and counting. T-minus 61 minutes on the Apollo 11 countdown, and all elements are go at this time. Astronaut Neil Armstrong has just completed a series of checks on that big service propulsion system engine that sits below him in the stack. We want to assure ourselves before liftoff that that engine can respond to commands from inside the spacecraft. As Neil Armstrong moved his rotational hand controller, we assured ourselves that the engine did respond by swiveling or gimbaling. This, of course, is important for maneuvers in space. The countdown is still proceeding very satisfactorily, other than 2 minor problems. Since we picked up the count at 11 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time last night, all has gone well. As we approach the 1 hour mark now in the count, a series of radio frequency and telemetry checks will be in progress with the launch vehicle. We'll also check out the tracking beacons in the instrument unit that travels as a guidance system for the Saturn V during the powered phase of flight. Now 59 minutes, 48 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.